Hey everybody, welcome to my latest video series titled Is Truth Relative? It's broken into 4 parts. Part 1 will introduce relativism. Part 2 will logically address relativism. Part 3 will morally address relativism. And Part 4 will make relativism relevant by discussing its influence on the modern Christian church. Please do not skip to the end. Each part builds on the previous one, so it is necessary to watch them in order. So in part 1, I will introduce the concept of relativism. What is relativism? To understand it, it is useful to define what truth is. Truth is an assertion that agrees with the facts or describes what is the actual state of a matter. So when we say that something is true, we mean it actually describes what is happening. There are 2 types of truth, absolute truth and relative truth. An absolute truth is an assertion whose truth is the same in all situations. So something that's absolutely true does not and cannot change no matter what. And this is the opposite of a relative truth, which is an assertion whose truth does depend on the situation. This table gives some examples of absolute and relative truths. Starting in morality, an absolute truth might be that stealing is morally wrong all the time. The relative version of that is that stealing can be right in certain situations. In logic, an absolute truth might be that if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C all the time. And the relative version of that is that A equals C only sometimes. Maybe A could equal D or E or nothing at all. In mathematics, some think that 2 plus 2 is 4 is an absolute truth, and the relative version of that is that the sum of 2 plus 2 could equal 3 or 5. And in science, an absolute truth might be that the boiling point of water in atmospheric conditions always equals 100 degrees Celsius. And the relative version of that is that the boiling point of water can vary. So an absolute truth stays the same, whereas a relative truth can vary. So relativism is the idea that absolute truth does not exist, meaning that all truths are relative. So everything from morality to logic to math to science, none of that is set in stone. What is true depends on the situation. This is different from skepticism, which is the idea that absolute truth does exist but cannot be known. For example, a skeptic might accept that scientific truth exists, but that error on the part of the scientist or in the instruments they use make knowing what that truth is impossible. So a skeptic would say that truth is difficult to discern, and a relativist goes a step beyond this and says that truth literally does not exist. Just so you know, there are other theories besides relativism that deny that absolute truth exists. You may have heard of postmodernism, which affirms no particular truth. Then there is pluralism, which says that all truth claims are equally valid, logically speaking. So if A equals B and B equals C, then A could equal C, or it couldn't. It just depends on the person. Then there is subjectivism, which says that truth is determined subjectively from our experiences. So there's no objective truth. All these beliefs, like relativism, deny that absolute truth exists. And I'm sure there are many others that I did not include, as well as the different subsets of relativism. I chose relativism to be the subject of these videos because it is probably the one that we are the most familiar with. Just know that as we go, the points I will make concerning relativism also apply to these theories. So why might one believe that truth is relative? Well, philosophically speaking, it's difficult to show that anything is absolutely true, even the things we think are obvious. So the relativist will say, you believe that absolute truth exists, prove it. And that is impossible to do, philosophically speaking. Relativists will also cite the fact that all truths are interpreted truths. In other words, each person ultimately must interpret what is true for them. And since truth for each person is based on their interpretation and interpretations can vary, then the truth must vary, right? And that makes all truths relative. You will hear this through statements like, your experiences and your truth is different from mine. They are referring to the fact that our perceptions of truth vary. Historically, relativism will cite historical figures who thought they had absolute truth when in reality they were wrong. Examples include the Roman Catholic Church that used to think that the earth was the center of the universe, or the old-time doctors that thought bloodletting would cure someone of their illness. History repeats itself, relativism will say. So statistically speaking, the chance that you have absolute truth is very low. In other words, how do we think we have absolute truth when so many have thought that same thing and been wrong? Relativism's moral reasons stem from their historical reasons. If for most of history mankind has been wrong about what is absolutely true, then isn't it arrogant to claim that we just now have the truth? Wouldn't that be overestimating our capabilities? Man is so feeble, so mentally weak, so limited in knowledge that he is incapable of knowing what absolute truth is, and to say otherwise is to think more highly of yourself than you ought to. This is especially the case when the truth claim one makes pertains to religion and the afterlife. So a relativist would say that historically most people have been wrong, which makes it statistically likely that we are wrong too, and hopefully we are humble enough to see that. The implication of relativism is that in the absence of absolute truth, truth is up to individuals or societies, or each person. So we are all left like the guy in the picture, who just doesn't know anything for certain. In a way, relativism is like the wind, seen in the picture on the right. You can see the effects of wind, like the sound it makes, or the fact that your kite is flying or that the trees are bending, but you can't actually see the wind. In the same way, we see the effects of relativism more than we see relativism itself. That is, relativism is rarely seen in its pure form. Rather, it is heard through statements like, you do you and I'll do me, but don't push your values on me. Or you just need to find a belief that resonates with you. Or it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you are well-intended. Or don't judge me for believing something different than you, and statements like it. Though they do not say it explicitly, these statements reflect an underlying belief that absolute moral truth does not exist. Now, in our culture, most relativists will deny absolute moral truth, but they will accept other forms of absolute truth, such as scientific truth or absolute logical truth. In fact, many relativists deny absolute moral truth on the basis of what they think is scientific truth. But this runs into some problems. Truth cannot be separated, meaning that one cannot deny it when it is convenient, as is often the case with absolute moral truth. One must either accept truth in all situations or deny it in all situations. Though your off-the-street relativist does not realize it, to deny moral truth is to deny all truth. And as I have very professionally put it, truth is a smoothie, not a buffet line. That is, one can't pick and choose like they would in a buffet line when to believe that truth exists. If truth exists in one situation, it exists in all situations. Now, this may be a shock to you, but comparing truth to a smoothie is not the most watertight argument. So I will spend a couple minutes showing why this is the case, logically speaking. Firstly, when the relativist says there is no truth, they leave the word truth singular. So they apply that truth is its own entity. They don't say there are no truths, plural, and then go on to list all the truths that don't exist. They leave truth singular, which affirms that if it doesn't exist in one situation, then it doesn't exist anywhere. This is why the definition of truth makes no distinction between situations. Truth is an assertion that agrees with the facts or states what is the case, regardless of whether that truth is in morality, logic, math, or science. Therefore, truth does not belong to a specific category. So to deny it in morality is to deny it in all areas. This is why the philosophers who invented relativism made no distinction. They understood the concept of truth well enough to know that it cannot be cherry-picked. It must be fully accepted or fully rejected. So I know this by the definition of truth. I also see it in practice. In order to practice any area of reasoning, one must accept that certain things are true. For example, the study of logic is based on laws that are universally accepted as true, and we use those laws to arrive at logical conclusions. So we see that logical truth is separate from logic. The same is true of the study of science. For example, as astronomers accept that the law of gravity is true and use it to calculate the orbits of planets and asteroids. So we see that scientific truth is separate from science. My point is that the concept of truth exists separately from our use of that truth. So to deny it once is to deny it always. So relativists, when they say moral truth doesn't exist but scientific truth does, are being inconsistent. Lastly, truth is interdependent. Things that are said to be absolutely morally true tends to manifest themselves in other areas, such as logic, math, and science. For example, some say that stealing is morally wrong. This moral truth is also a logical truth. For example, if everyone stole from each other, then our society would collapse. So logically speaking, we say that stealing is unsustainable. Therefore, stealing, which is morally wrong, should also be avoided for logical reasons. The point is that if what is morally true is also logically true, then truth is a concept that is independent of what form it takes. Therefore, to deny one form of truth is to deny all truth. And there is a fourth reason for this that will be explained later. So we know that truth is a single entity from the definition of relativism, the definition of truth, from practice, and from interdependence. Therefore, an exclusively moral relativist does not exist. That is, truth is not a buffet line where you can pick and choose which parts of it you like. It is more like a smoothie that must be entirely ingested or entirely rejected. One cannot both deny and accept truth whenever it is convenient. This is critically important because it greatly expands the audience that my arguments will apply to. Not only does it include those who deny all truth, like certain philosophers, it now includes your off-the-street relativist who loves to deny only moral truth. For to deny one form of truth is to deny them all. So relativism is the idea that all truths in every category are relative. Now that we understand that, parts 2 through 4 will reference this outline. Part 2 addresses relativism logically and contains an argument that shows that absolute truth exists. Premise 1 states that if no truth is absolute, then all truths must be relative. This was explained earlier. This premise has the format, if A is true, then B is true. Premise 2 states that not all truths can be relative, which has a format, B is not true. There are two reasons for this. The first is that the evidence offered for relativism is insufficient, and the second is that relativism logically defeats itself, which will yield the conclusion that some truths are absolute. This may look complex, but all this argument says is that if all truths cannot be relative, then some truths must be absolute. At the end of part 2, I will summarize it and discuss its implications. Now, before we move on, note that I am not directly proving the existence of absolute truth, because that would be logically impossible. To directly prove it would be to assume that some things are absolutely true, such as the laws of logic. That is, if they weren't absolutely true, there would be no point in arguing. But if I use what is absolutely true to prove absolute truth, then I am guilty of circular reasoning. This is why I prove its existence indirectly through the impossibility of relativism. Part 3 addresses relativism morally. This part discusses the true nature of relativism as revealed through its actions. So I will contrast the claims of relativism with its actions. At the end of part 3, I will summarize it and discuss its implications. And part 4 makes relativism relevant by discussing the influence of relativism on the modern Christian church. So that's the end of part 1. In part 2, I will address relativism logically per our outline.